All right. So we have now the video lecture for politics of the 1950s. And you can see there on the cover of this title slide, you can see that the 1950s politically is dominated by Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower became the Republican president in the 1950s. And really, for the most part, I would say he was kind of a moderate. He was conservative, but he wasn't an extreme conservative. We're going to see that, in things like Social Security, which is an old New Deal program, he actually expanded that. He is largely responsible for the funding of the Federal Highway Act. And so Eisenhower, even though he's a Republican, he's probably not the most conservative Republican that we've had. Certainly not compared to the ones of the 1920s. Now, at the same time, he's not really a liberal either, and you can see that by the kind of the mocking cartoon on the left, where civil rights has really started to develop and blossom into a major, movement by the 1950s, and Eisenhower is kind of reluctant to act. Um, he just kind of hopes. I think probably it's accurate to say that he kind of hoped that he didn't have to deal with it. But unfortunately, he is going to have to deal with it. And he deals with it really not in a sense that he's a civil rights advocate himself, but more because it's a challenge to national authority. But it is during Eisenhower's time that we see the civil rights era start to come into full swing. But again, largely not because of Eisenhower himself. The other thing that we're going to see kind of take center stage is this growing animosity and fear of the Soviet Union. And so we have kind of the fear of communism. We know that in the early 1950s, we have people like Joseph McCarthy who are accusing people left and right of being communists. McCarthy's by the mid 1950s, his power is going to go down. But we also have this fear in society that there's somewhere in Russia there's this guy Ivan, and he's got one finger on the nuclear button, and that he's going to blow us up. And so you see that reflected even in like American schools where they used to do air raid drills and duck and cover drills. Like that would have done you a lot of good. But these are things that were prevalent in terms of foreign policy and things that we thought of with the fear of communism. All right, so let's move on to politics of the 1950s here. We start with the election of 1952. Here you can see that we have a somewhat pretty divided America. You have most of America in the north and in certainly west of the Mississippi River, excluding Arkansas and Louisiana. You you have a pretty Republican country at this point. So I would say that this is far and wide kind of a very moderate to conservative America. Obviously we do have some holdovers from the New Deal, but I wouldn't think of those as the places in blue. I mean, really, we're seeing the Democrats in blue. They are, they are not the New Deal Democrats. They are conservative Democrats. They are against civil rights. But for the most part, when we look at this 1952 election, we really see kind of this movement of America to kind of a conservative or moderate America, as opposed to the mid 1940s, where most of the screen would have been blue. And now the places that are blue aren't blue because they're liberals. It's because of their civil rights beliefs, most of them. Okay, the vice president, I think it's important to point out that the vice presidential candidate for the 1952 election for Dwight Eisenhower was Richard Nixon. And you can see Richard Nixon in the bottom right-hand corner there. Now, he drew a little bit of criticism because his family had accepted this dog named Checkers. And there was some rumors of kind of impropriety in terms of the way that they obtained the dog. And so almost immediately, as we first saw Nixon as kind of a red hunter, as somebody who is strong on communism. In fact, that's why he was put on the Eisenhower ticket, because he was kind of seen as a foreign policy guru, as somebody who is strong against communism. And so he kind of balanced out Eisenhower, who was kind of the nice guy. Richard Nixon was more the strong arm in terms of fighting communism. So in this, back to his dog, there was this speech that he gave called the Checkers speech, in which he defended himself. But almost early on, for when we see Nixon, he's kind of already getting himself in trouble a little bit. But he does help to balance the ticket, and the Republicans win the 1952 election. And really, for most of the 1950s until the end, the Republicans are going to be in control of the government. Okay. All right. So let us talk about the birth of the civil rights movement. I think you want to think about like causes, like what kind of happens to cause the civil rights movement. It could have happened 100 years before. It could have happened 50 years before. Why does it happen in the 1950s? And so I think a good place to start are the contributions that African Americans made during World War II. Everything from the most famous group like this, Tuskegee Airmen, down to the units that fought in World War II. You have a lot of hundreds of thousands, literally, of African Americans who fought during World War II, and they really believed that they had earned their place in society. Now, some of these people were able to benefit from the GI Bill of Rights, and they were able to get college educations. Sometimes not at white universities, but at places like Howard University or Grambling or Tuskegee or some of these places that were historically black colleges. But the point is, what this is going to do is this is going to bring in a new generation of African American leaders, because you're going to have a growth of an African American middle class. And so when we take a look at some of the great leaders that we have of the civil rights era, Thurgood Marshall and Martin Luther King, just to name a couple, these people, they are a legacy of the accomplishments made by African Americans during World War II. Okay, so kind of going along with that idea, then we talked about this growth of the urban middle class, and I think you should probably write down a few of these kind of groups that are part of that. So definitely ministers, and you can see that Martin Luther King Jr. Was part of that group. I would also say teachers that were black teachers were a part of that middle class. But then you start to get people that are lawyers, people that are, some sort of urban professional, that they have an education, and as a result, they have thoughts and they have a voice, and so that urban black middle class is going to be very important in terms of leadership for the civil rights era. Okay. Not only do I want to call it racism of popular culture, but the conformity, the segregation of things like white middle class, these became things that African American leaders pointed out in terms of, hey, we're being excluded. Not only is it racism, but it's also just discrimination in general. The cultural norms for the middle class did not include African Americans. And so that development of 1950s popular culture, that really provided, a target to go after, of ammunition to use in terms of, hey, this isn't right. We're being left out. We're being discriminated against. We need to do something about it. Okay. And so probably by about 1950, I guess there's no exact date for the beginning of the civil rights era, but I think, the 1954, 1955, those 2 years in particular, that is where we start to see some dramatic things happen in terms of change. Okay. So obviously the first one is the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. And then if you don't know this, about a year later or so, there's another pretty monumental decision that is kind of collectively known as Brown versus Board 2. But this is the Supreme Court. And I think it's important that you understand this, that it's a Supreme Court who was picked to be conservative. It's called the Warren Court. I would write that down. Earl Warren. Earl Warren was the former governor of California, and you can see him in the middle. He kind of looks like, I guess, Colonel Sanders from KFC. You can see him down there in the middle there. I guess that's not very nice, but he's the guy that's kind of brought in by Eisenhower, and most of these justices were actually seen kind of in their history as fairly conservative. but it is the leadership of the Supreme Court that begins to dismantle the desegregation, and the segregation that was established by Plessy versus Ferguson, and the rule or the doctrine of separate but equal. You really got to give credit to the Supreme Court, because they are the first kind of group in America that had power that helped start to create this desegregation process. And you combine that with the amazing leadership of the NAACP, and then in the Black community that was brave, that was, that fought out against these injustices. That's what really starts to get the ball rolling. Now, really, for the most part, there were areas throughout the country that did start to desegregate, but as you can imagine, in the South, there are a lot of places that basically ignored Brown versus Board of Education. And it's kind of personified in this idea of the Southern Manifesto. And so when you write down Southern Manifesto, you're going to really write down massive resistance by the South. I mean, that's what the Southern Manifesto is all about, of ignoring these rules, of only trying to reiterate and reinforce segregation. You saw state governments that just flat out simply would not comply. They would use funds that were supposed to be used to create integrated schools, to create schools for white people, for white kids. So really, the Southern Manifesto is all about resisting desegregation. I think we kind of tend to think that once Brown versus Board of Education happens, that everything was smooth and that everything desegregated. That is really not the case. And it was going to take years and years of diligence before desegregation, first of all, in terms of education, but also in Southern society, would be successfully challenged and gotten rid of. Okay, in 1957, after the Supreme Court had ordered all schools to desegregate with all deliberate speed. 3 years later, you have Central Arkansas and Little Rock, Arkansas, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, who is refusing to allow African Americans to come into their high school. And the governor is Orville Faubus. He won't do anything. He's not going to do anything to stop the people harassing these African Americans trying to come into school. And it is at this point that Eisenhower comes in, not as really a civil rights advocate, but as someone who sees this as a threat to the decisions made by the federal government. And so that's really why he sends in the National Guard. He escorts these 9 African Americans into school until things calm down. And this is kind of known as the Little Rock 9 incident. What I think is important, though, is that even though Eisenhower is not really seen as a civil rights advocate, the fact that the federal government is going to uphold these decisions made by the Supreme Court, that gives the Supreme Court's decisions teeth. And that means that, hey, it's going to be a process, but we are on our way to improving things for African Americans. One of the most famous incidences of the 1950 in terms of the civil rights struggle was obviously the Montgomery bus boycott. And so throughout the South, we know that we had Jim Crow or segregation laws. And one of the areas that those applied to were on public buses. And a lot of middle class to lower middle class to low class people depended on public transportation to be able to get to and from home and work and wherever else they needed to go. And, Black people were supposed to typically sit in the back of the bus. And then, white people were allowed to sit up front where they could get on and off the easiest. And Rosa Parks decided that she was not going to do that. And so she was arrested, and she knew she would get arrested. But that sparked really a amalgamation of African Americans, not only in Montgomery, Alabama, but really around the South to galvanize, to come together. And we see, especially in Montgomery, this very, very strict boycott of the buses. And you have to understand that the buses really need African Americans for them to be able to kind of run and to operate. And this is a very effective boycott. And what it does is it empowers African Americans to do other things, to protest other injustices and evils that we see. And so we'll see this not only in the 50s, but we'll also start to see this in the 60s as well. Now, it is during the boycott of the buses that we see the rise or the ascension of Martin Luther King Jr. as really the leader of the civil rights movement in the South. And he becomes the leader of what is called the Southern Southern Christian Leader. I cannot say it. Southern Conference of Leadership. I can't say the SCLC. Sorry, it's been a long day and I cannot speak right now. But he becomes the leader of the SCLC, and with that, this Southern Christian Leadership Conference. There we go, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He becomes the leader of this group, and this is really the group that helps to organize resistance throughout the South and then really throughout the country. And I think what's important to know about this group and about Martin Luther King Jr. are his philosophies that he adopted from people like Gandhi in India, from Thoreau through civil disobedience, through his teachings in Christianity that he's learned as a Baptist minister. And these are the ideas of passive resistance. That look, if they punch us, we're just going to turn the other cheek. We are going to defy these. If we get arrested, that's okay. But we're not going to fight. We're not going to loot. We're not going to riot. We are going to peacefully protest. And that becomes sort of an enduring mark of this time for the civil rights era, is that they're not causing a lot of violence or things like that we're going to see later when we get to, say like the Black Panthers or something like that, or Malcolm X, where they're advocating for violence if demands are not met. Martin Luther King was not like that. It was passive resistance, but it was this idea of, that civil disobedience that Gandhi and Thoreau had talked about. Okay, let us talk about the policies of Eisenhower during the 50s that can be summed up in the term dynamic conservatism. And so obviously this is a contradiction. It's very difficult to have both of these, dynamic change and conservatism at the same time. And so what this really is it's really conservatism. It's moderate. It's in a moderate approach to change. But at the same time, you need to understand, like I said before, that, Eisenhower in some ways is he's not going to get rid of those New Deal programs. And in fact, some of those things are going to stick around. So you get an extension of Social Security instead of, some really conservative Republicans are like, get rid of Social Security. He not only keeps them, but he includes more people in the Social Security system. He does a very Democrat thing. He increases minimum wage up to like $1 an hour. And then some of the things like urban renewal, subsidizing farmers, even though he reduces the subsidies on farmers, for the most part, this idea of the welfare state where, and I think a good way to think of the welfare state is the federal government is now a safety net for people. And so ideas like unemployment insurance, guaranteeing bank deposits, all those kind of things, the federal government is the safety net for the economy and for the poor people of the economy. And we could say that Eisenhower does nothing to get rid of those kind of programs. He may have reduced some of them, but he didn't get rid of them. We know that probably one of the most Democrat things he does is the Federal Highway Act. Remember, he's largely influenced by what he saw in Germany with the Autobahn. He wants to do this for the movement of our military. He wants to do this for trade and transportation. So that, that's kind of a big thing. But he is conservative, right? And so he did reduce the number of people working for the federal government. By the time that he left office, there was like $1 billion surplus in the budget. And like I said, he did lower farm subsidies. So he's kind of a little bit of a contradiction. I mean, there are some Democrat things that he does, but for the most part, it's pretty conservative. Okay, on to foreign policy. So foreign policy in the 1950s is all about the fear of communism, all about the, containing the spread of communism. Remember, the Truman Doctrine is kind of followed in some way, shape, or form by the various presidents and people of the Secretary of States and Secretary of Defenses in the United States throughout this entire period. So it is a version of containment. But the Secretary of State for much of the 1950s is this corporate lawyer by the name of John Foster Dulles. And he was kind of a belligerent guy in terms of he wanted to do containment, but he wanted to do it in a different way. He wanted to use the threat of the nuclear bomb as a way to get the Soviet Union and other countries sort of in line with what the United States wanted to do. And so he wanted to use this idea of massive retaliation, or what we call brinkmanship. It's kind of like nuclear poker, if you want to think of it that way. It's like, hey, we're the country that used the bomb. If you don't do what we're going to do, we're not afraid to launch another one to get you to do what we want. Now, Eisenhower liked this idea and he called it getting more bang for his buck. In other words, he could reduce the amount of troops and like traditional armaments that the military was spending money on and focus on building the few atomic weapons that he would need to use as a threat. And so it kind of worked two kind of angles there. One, we could reduce the amount of spending on traditional types of military things, but also exert our force with this idea of brinkmanship, of taking us to the brink of war without actually going there. All right, one of the things that scared us the most was the launching of a little satellite from the Soviet Union called Sputnik. And Sputnik was really detrimentally harmful to us from a psychological perspective, because it showed that the Soviet Union was ahead of us. And so all of a sudden you get massive efforts by public education and education in general and scientific research that say, we've got to catch up with the Russians. They are ahead of us. They are smarter than us. But beyond that, not only did it scare us into redoubling our efforts for scientific research and education, it just scared us in general, because if they could launch this satellite into outer space, could they use that same technology to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles, at us? Could they send missiles from the Soviet Union for somewhere else from far away and get us? And we needed to catch up. We needed to have that technology as well. And so Sputnik, while it's just like a harmless little satellite, it's the technology and the ideas behind it that really freaked us out. Now, by the time that the Eisenhower years were over, one of the other major incidents that happened, and this happened right as really Nikita Khrushchev, who is now at this point the head of the Communist Party and the Soviet premier, basically the leader of the Soviet Union, he and Eisenhower had set up these meetings where they were going to, normalize relations a little bit better. There was going to be kind of a cooling period between the two, so there wasn't as much tension. And in the middle of those talks, the Russians shot down one of our U-2 spy planes, these high atmosphere spy planes. And at first we denied it. We were like, oh no, we don't have any planes over there. And then they produced the pilot, and they're like, look, we got your pilot, and it's Gary Francis Powers. And so it was kind of embarrassing. It was a humiliation to us from an international perspective that we kind of lied about this and denied it. And then like, hey, we got your pilot. Here he is. He's alive, and we have proof that you basically did this. And so this is something that we did that escalated the tension during the Cold War. All right, really quickly to finish off here, some final foreign policy incidents that you might need to know at least something about during the 1950s. In the early 1950s, as an indication that oil is becoming of major importance due to the prominence of the automobile and the highway system, the United States engineered a coup in Iran that got rid of really the person in charge that most of the Iranians wanted, and put in power really a puppet Shah that would be promoting American interests, allow American businesses to come in and exploit Iranian oil. And if you look at the problems that the United States have with the Iranians today, here's where it started. The Iranians hate us, and they probably should hate us, because we pretty much took out the person that they wanted to have in charge of their country and put in somebody that would be friendly to American business. All right, in the 1950s, we also see the beginnings of the problems in Vietnam. Now, Vietnam, if you remember, it originally, before World War II, was a French colony, and it was called French Indochina. During World War II, the Japanese came in and took it over. And then obviously, once the Japanese lost in World War II, then the French tried to reclaim and retake it over. But by this time, there was a strong insurgent group of nationalists that were communist-leaning, led by Ho Chi Minh, And they were putting pressure, much like in Korea was, to kind of invade the South. And so the French, by 1954, they had an incident in Dien Bien Phu where they just effectively got their clocks cleaned and almost washed their hands of the situation, saying, look, we can no longer keep the situation stable. And so in 1954, it's really the end of the French era in Vietnam and the beginning of the American era, where we kind of say, well, wait a minute, according to containment, we can't allow this to happen. And so slowly but surely in the 1950s, and then we'll see especially in the 60s, the American presence in Vietnam will increase. Okay, kind of like in Iran and Guatemala, because of plantation interests and things like that, we again help to engineer a coup, and really we help put in place people that are not that good at people, but they're friendly to American business. Same thing in Cuba. We're going to see. So let me just fast forward here. Throughout much of the 1950s, much like Guatemala, we are working with people that are friendly to American business, and so by the end of the 1950s, Americans have taken over much of Cubans' resources. The American mafia has taken over a lot of like the restaurant and nightlife industry in Cuba. The hotel businesses are almost primarily owned by American gangsters, and Cuba's had enough. And so, we own most of the plantations that were in Cuba. And so by the end of the 1950s, Fidel Castro comes in with his communist-leaning group, and they expropriate, they nationalize. They basically say to all American businesses, thank you very much. These are ours now. You can get your butts out of our country. And this begins the beginning of animosity between America and Cuba. And if you're sitting there going, well, didn't we create a lot of these situations? The answer is yes. We did a lot of these things to ourselves, that created our own problems. Now, one of the things that wasn't especially our fault was in Egypt. In Egypt, I guess it was kind of our fault because the leadership in Egypt wanted to build a big dam on the Nile River, and they were not really friendly to American business, so we didn't kind of really work with them. But more importantly, to pay for the dam, the leadership of Egypt, they seized the Suez Canal, and the British were like, hey, wait a minute, we need access to that. We've been controlling that. And so they sent troops in. We ended up not supporting the French and the British in that. We ended up kind of an uneasy negotiation and got the British and the French to kind of leave. And then from that point on, Anwar Sadat and the Egyptian leadership, they controlled the Suez Canal. Now today, that's not exactly the case. Now really the United Nations, through UNCLOS, controls the Suez Canal. But in 1956, we had a real crisis in the Suez because Egypt basically just took over the Suez Canal from international shipping. Okay, last one, Hungary in 1956. They had a democratic uprising where they were trying to get rid of a dictator. They called for help. They asked for America's help, and we did not want to get involved because we thought it would lead to a direct clash with the Soviets, who had really backed the dictator of Hungary at the time. Hungary becomes behind the Iron Curtain. Hungary is a part now of the Soviet Socialist Republics, and we kind of let that one go. It's kind of interesting that we went to Korea, we went to Vietnam, but we did not go to Hungary to help them. Okay, that takes care of the major foreign policy events and the domestic policies of the 1950s. Thank you for tuning in, and